My name is Jonathan Mair, and I'd like to thank the organisers of the symposium for the opportunity to participate. I'm a social anthropologist, and I've specialised in the study of Buddhist communities in my career. One of my main research interests has been Fo Guang Shan Humanistic Buddhism. Starting in London in 2009, my research has given me the privilege of meeting and befriending many Fo Guang Shan venerables and lay devotees, and of taking part in many practices, including short-term monastic retreats in Taiwan and Paris. One of the things I've learned through this research is that the methods of social anthropology, my discipline, have many things in common with humanistic Buddhism. Perhaps that's not surprising, since both aim to understand the human being in all its aspects: mental, corporeal, social, and so on. I believe that these affinities between humanistic Buddhism and social anthropology mean that social anthropology has a lot to learn about human life in general from the teachings of Master Xing Yun and the practice of humanistic Buddhism. I'll say a little bit about that, but my main purpose here is to humbly suggest, in line with Master Xing Yun's teaching that Buddhism should learn from the best elements of all traditions and practices, that social anthropology can also provide some insights and methods that might be useful for Fo Guang Shan in its attempts to understand diverse communities and to use skillful means to adapt humanistic Buddhism for the benefit of all beings. Social anthropologists study human beings, and especially the variety of their cultures and societies. There are many other kinds of scholars who do similar things: sociologists, historians, economists, for example. But anthropologists have developed a distinctive way of studying. Rather than relying on primary or documentary evidence or questionnaires, their main method is to build long-term relationships with members of the communities that they study. They try to learn to live as those people live, taking part in their practices in order to experience them firsthand. We usually send our students out on their own to live in a place that is strange to them for around a year in order to understand it deeply. This emphasis on personal experience and first-person experience has led anthropologists to emphasize a number of principles that are distinctive within the social sciences, but which I think are similar in some respects to the approach of humanistic Buddhists. The first is the importance of relationships. Anthropologists study people's activities not only by reading about them or asking about them, but by getting involved in person. And when you experience activities firsthand, you suddenly find yourself linked to other people by a network of relationships. Activities such as religious rituals or business activities, for example, which seem very goal-oriented in practice, are often just as important for their relationship building effects as they are for their economic effects or their religious goals. The second principle is the importance of the human body. The body is something that has to be cared for. It's born, it suffers, it ages, it sickens, and it dies. It must be attended to every day. So when we're involved in activities practically in a first-person sense, our attention is drawn to the way in which embodiment fundamentally conditions every human practice. The third principle is the social construction of knowledge. The categories we use to think are what Buddhists would call conventional truth, not ultimate truth. Different cultures divide the world in different ways, and our categories can change dramatically between historical periods. Ethnographic research shows that categories such as kinship and ethnicity change dramatically, even for the same person, depending on the practice and the context in which they are involved. Nonetheless, as much as they vary, these constructed categories have real effects, just as the concept of the self in Buddhism is both empty and has important effects. In a number of my publications aimed at my social anthropology colleagues, I have already argued that the discipline of social anthropology should learn from the insights and wisdom of humanistic Buddhism. That's not the main topic of my talk today, but just to give you one brief example, together with my collaborator, Professor James Laidlaw of Cambridge University, I published an article on the relationship of religion to everyday life in the American journal Cultural Anthropology in 2019. This article was later republished in Humanistic Buddhism, the Fo Guang Shan academic journal. In the article, we addressed a basic model widely shared by anthropologists and other social scientists who are interested in religion. According to this model, largely based on the work of French sociologist Émile Durkheim, human experience can be divided into a profane sphere of everyday life governed by self-interest and a sacred sphere of religious ritual governed by values and morality. These two spheres are supposed to be opposed, and a great deal of academic effort has been spent trying to understand how everyday life can be related to the transcendent world of religion and ritual. In our paper, we based our argument on our first-hand experience of Fo Guang Shan's rituals, and especially the practice of the short-term monastic retreat, which we undertook in Paris and Taiwan, and also on Master Xingyun's teaching that Chan never leaves the human world. Our conclusion was that our anthropological colleagues should abandon Durkheim's distinction and adopt the humanistic understanding of religion as part of human life. There are many such lessons, I think, that social anthropology and the social sciences in general can learn from humanistic Buddhism. However, today I want to suggest that there may be some areas in which the opposite is also the case. Fo Guang Shan aims to promote humanistic Buddhism to every society to make the Buddha's light shine over the 5 continents. As Master Xingyun has explained, this requires some sensitivity to cultural difference. As human beings are always in local relationships and are always formed by culturally specific habits, any practice must be adapted to local requirements using skillful means. There are some excellent and well-known examples of localization in Fo Guang Shan, of which the organization is rightly proud. For example, the use of football in Brazil to help the children of the favelas, or of music and dance in South Africa and the Philippines. However, it is clear that the early goal of having many forms of localized Buddhism led by local people is progressing quite slowly in most countries in which Fo Guang Shan is active. While Fo Guang Shan has spread around the world with astonishing speed, most devotees continue to be drawn from Chinese communities. Serving Chinese communities is a very important function, but perhaps more could be done to attract other communities around the world more effectively. I suggest that social anthropology and ethnographic research in particular, conducted among target communities, is one way in which Fo Guang Shan could achieve that aspiration. One lesson from social anthropology that could prove useful is what we might call the problem of the first family in the village. Social anthropologists used to carry out their research exclusively in small villages. They would arrive and make friends and find somewhere to live, and then spend a long time, often up to 2 years, living life in the village and making observations. As this research method became established, a common problem emerged. Often one family would greet the anthropologist very warmly and take him or her in as one of their own. That sounds good, but it often turned out to be a problem. Often it was the case that these families who were eager to ally themselves with outsiders were not like their neighbors or were even in conflict with them. Anthropologists came to understand that they had to take great care not to be overly influenced by their early alliances in order to avoid distorting their research. I think this lesson is also potentially useful for Fo Guang Shan. I've now been attending Fo Guang Shan events for about 10 years. In that time, I've met many of the non-Chinese participants who were attracted to the temples. Of course, it's impossible to generalize in a way that applies to all of these people, but there are some irregular characteristics. For example, many non-Chinese participants are highly educated and emphasize the importance of critical thinking and Buddhism as a practice of self-cultivation. Such people have often been brought up in religious households, especially Christian ones. They often appreciate the values that they were brought up with, but reject what they see as the authoritarianism and superstition of organized religion. For them, Buddhism is a philosophy and a practice, and not a religion. This understanding of Buddhism, though it's very different from Fo Guang Shan's understanding, is not really an obstacle in terms of these people's relationship with Fo Guang Shan. After all, Master Xingyun's teachings emphasize giving others convenience. These scientifically minded people are also good allies for Fo Guang Shan because they're enthusiastic about studying Buddhism and about learning Buddhist practices. They're often well positioned in society and will be able to support Fo Guang Shan now or in the future. However, this may be a case of first family in the village in the sense that the more Fo Guang Shan adapts its offer for this kind of participant, the less it will appeal to some other people. The more Fo Guang Shan monastics take these exceptional people to be typical of Western people in general, the more this relationship may become an obstacle to effective localization aimed at other communities. Let me say something here about the idea of the West and Westerners. When I used to teach students about the anthropology of China, I always began by trying to clear away some unhelpful but widespread ways of thinking. One of these is the categorical distinction between East and West. People are used to speaking of Western thought and Eastern thought, or Asian culture and European culture. At a very general level, these distinctions might be helpful, but they are often very misleading. The East-West distinction, like all distinctions, is empty of intrinsic existence. Every East is only East relative to some other locations, and relative to others, it's West. So how did we come to think of these disparate areas in Europe, North America, and Australia as the West, and of Asia as being the East? Well, the history is well understood, of course. The distinction emerged from people in Europe thinking of themselves as being civilized and Christian in dialogue and conflict with people who they thought of as pagans or with Muslims in the lands directly to the east of where they were living. Later, in contrast to Enlightenment Christianity, which emphasized cold reason and pragmatism, the East came to be associated with imagination, art, emotion, and tradition. These ideas about the East and the West were initially applied by Europeans to the Near or Middle East, essentially what was the Ottoman Empire. Later, they were extended to apply to the so-called Far East, including India, China, and Japan. In the end, the whole of the complexity of the world was encompassed by this very simple binary distinction between East and West. And the East-West distinction came to be embraced by influential nationalist thinkers in Asia as well. In China, for example, Liang Shuming made it the basis of his influential Eastern and Western cultures and their philosophies. In this way, many people in Asia also came to accept the image of themselves as different in a categorical way from people in Europe and North America, more emotional and intuitive, less scientific and rational, less individualistic, more communal, and more bound to tradition. This distinction between East and West also seems important in Fo Guang Shan's ideas about its activities around the world. For instance, I've been told many times by members of Fo Guang Shan that Buddhism in the West must adapt for Western people by becoming more scientific. The idea is that talk of fate, deities, and ghosts, miracles, and even life after death might be difficult for Western people to accept and should be avoided. This is also the way in which many people in, for example, the UK think of themselves in contrast to people from the East. The idea of Westerners as people who are strongly attached to a scientific and rational approach to the world does fit some people, especially highly educated people in major cities. However, anthropological and ethnographic studies of ordinary people in the US, France, the UK, and other countries that we think of as Western tell us that these scientific rationalists are not that typical. Instead, studies have shown that many British people, like people everywhere, believe they can communicate with spirits of the dead, that they will be reborn, and that their lives will unfold according to a destiny or fate over which they have limited control. Take, for example, the small town in Kent in southeast England, in which I lived until last year. The town is about an hour's journey from London. It has a population of only 35,000 people, but Google lists no less than 11 professional clairvoyant services that help people to read their futures or to communicate with the spirits of their dead. The residents of that town are in general very unlike the non-Chinese participants who turn up to events at London Fo Guang Temple. They're unlike socially, economically, in terms of their education, and in terms of their beliefs. They have some distinctive challenges and problems for which humanistic Buddhism might be helpful. But in order really to help them, Fo Guang Shan monastics and lay devotees would need to understand the East-West distinction not as an absolute truth, but as a convention by which people come to understand themselves in relation to others. This seems to me a condition without which it would be impossible to develop effective, skillful means for dealing with these people. There are already a number of Fo Guang Shan students and scholars who apply social anthropological knowledge and ethnographic methods to study Fo Guang Shan communities. I'm aware of at least 2 PhD students in the UK, including a former student of mine. What I'm suggesting here is that it would benefit the aim of promoting humanistic Buddhism if that attention were also turned outward, if Fo Guang Shan were to use anthropological knowledge to understand others, and perhaps even send monastics or lay people to live among and study other communities using ethnographic research methods to understand their perspectives and their problems. If anyone who is listening to this is interested in discussing the possibility of conducting this research further, please get in touch. Thank you very much.